All right. Video's live, so we're going to start. Y'all ready?
No, I'm good.
You guys good? Okay. I'll leave that door open. All right. Can you guys see the... All right, here we go. Yeah. I have a whole camera here. All right, guys. We have to leave at 4, so I want to go ahead and get started right away. For those of you that are new to the review session, thank you for coming. Come and go as you'd like. You do not have to stay the whole time. This is totally for you. I just ask that while you're in this room, and especially because I have to make this awkward video that I hate, but that you guys love, that you keep your voices down in here, okay? And if at any point you have a question, yeah, that's great, Brian. If at any point you have a question, just raise your hand. I'm happy to answer your questions. I'll also ask for questions at the end, but the first thing I'm going to try and do is fly through the study guide. So we'll go through each unit. I'll ask for questions at the end of every unit study guide, or each article study guide. Got it? You ready? Okay. You guys are going to be great. So test is 26 questions. You have to finish those 26 questions in 38 minutes. And then you have one FRQ that's 20 minutes long. That's the quantitative analysis FRQ, the exact FRQ that we looked at in class today. Okay? Questions about the format of the test. There'll be straight multiple choice, those charts like you saw, and then also stimulus questions. Okay? All right, so let's start with the legislative branch. So Article 1 is the legislative branch. We know we have a bicameral or two-chamber legislature. We have the House of Representatives based on state population. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives. We talked about the process for drawing district lines happens every 10 years. When based on population changes, we reapportion seats to states based on population changes. So every 10 years after the Senate census, states might gain or lose seats through the reapportionment process, okay? This is for the House of Representatives specifically. We talked about gerrymandering as important to the reapportionment process, where the state legislature gets to redraw the district boundaries. And gerrymandering is this often illogical drawing of district boundaries to favor a political party. And we talked about 2 different strategies of gerrymandering. We talked about packing. Packing is trying to pack the opposition party into as few districts as possible to minimize their influence in that state. So they pack them all into as few districts as possible. We talked about cracking is when they divide the opposition party up into districts where they don't have a majority in any district to try and minimize their influence, packing and cracking. We know that gerrymandering has been ruled legal. The Supreme Court in the Baker v. Carr case established 2 things. One, the Supreme Court does have jurisdiction over gerrymandering, because gerrymandering is technically a state responsibility. So they said, yes, we can intervene when gerrymandering becomes a problem. And 2, that districts need to be about the same size. Baker v. Carr established the one person, one vote doctrine. And the circumstances of the case was in Tennessee, they hadn't redrawn the districts to reflect population changes. So they found that the rural districts had as equal voice to the urban districts that had a lot more people. The districts were unequal. That's called malapportionment. So now, because of the one person, one vote doctrine, the districts have to be about the same size. Okay, so today districts are about 750,000 people. The other thing that the Supreme Court ruled in regards to gerrymandering was in Shaw versus Reno. And what they ruled is that racial gerrymandering using race as the predominant factor, is also illegal. So you can't draw a district with just white people or just Black people in it. You cannot draw district lines based on race. Okay? Questions about gerrymandering?
What you just said about race was Shaw v. Reno, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And Baker v. Carr is one person, one vote doctrine. Yeah.
So does this happen when you're voting for a mayor in a certain district?
Ooh, that's a good question. Not usually for a mayor, because a mayor represents a city, but gerrymandering also occurs when we're voting for our state officials. So we vote for people in the federal government to represent us, and we also vote for people to represent us in our state Congress, and our state assembly districts are also gerrymandered. So, but when we're talking about gerrymandering for the purposes of our class, we're talking about for the House of Representatives specifically. So Congress reapportions or redistributes the seats, and then the state legislatures redraw the district lines based on those new numbers. So California has 53, maybe someday we'll have 54, we get a new district, all of our districts would have to be reapportioned or redrawn to make sure they're all about 750,000 people and to give the new district its spot as well. Okay, yes?
I'm confused. You said something, Charles. Would you shorten what you just said a second time, please?
What did I say?
I don't know. You said like someone makes the lines and then we like reapportion.
Okay, so Congress reapportions the seats or redistributes the seats based on census data. So Congress says, okay, California gains a seat, Utah loses a seat, just based on population shifts, okay, and state population. Then the district lines are drawn by the state legislature. So that's why the Baker v. Carr case first said, yeah, the Supreme Court can rule, because gerrymandering is technically a state responsibility. Reapportionment, drawing district lines, once you've given the number of seats you have, is a state responsibility. Yes, Matt?
So we're district number 40.
53 and 49. 52 and 49.
So we vote for a certain.
You only get to vote for the representative that represents the district in which you reside. So you either live in 52 or you live in 49. So you either get to vote for Scott Peters in 52 and whoever he's running against in the next election, and Darrell Issa and whoever he's running against in the next election. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives. You have to be 30 years of age. You have to have been a citizen for 7 years. You have to reside in the state in which you represent. The House chamber specific responsibilities, they get to vote to impeach a president or any other federal official. We're watching that process take place right now. They have the power of the purse in the House of Representatives. They get to create tax legislation. It must start in the House of Representatives. And also, if there were if there was a tie in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives would decide our president. Okay. The Senate, originally we did not directly elect our senators. Remember, the 17th Amendment called for the direct election of senators. That changed the original Constitution. Previously, senators were selected by the state legislature. Now we elect our senators. You have to be 25 to be a member of the House, 30 to be a member of Senate. You have to have been a citizen for 9 years. You have to reside in the state in which you represent. Just like in the House, you have to reside in the district that you represent. Senate-specific responsibilities, they approve of all presidential appointments. They hold the impeachment trial in the Senate. So the trial happens in the Senate, with the whole Senate becoming the jury. The Senate also confirms or ratifies treaties with a 2/3 vote. What else does the Senate do specifically? Appointments, treaties.
Filibuster.
They do filibustering, but that's not a job that they have. And I guess the hearing. I feel like I'm missing one. The Senate was intended to be the more prestigious. Don't forget, they serve for 6 years. The House only serves for 2. And a term of Congress is just 2 years. It aligns with the term of the members of the House of Representatives. Okay? Treaties. Ratify treaties as well in the Senate. Okay. Questions about who's in the bicameral legislature and what they do. Okay. We talked a little bit about the enumerated versus implied powers. Enumerated are the specific powers given to Congress by the Constitution. We talked about it being things that wouldn't make sense for any one state to do. Also, the lawmaking power, that's the most important power that Congress has. Implied powers are things that they do that aren't specifically stated in the Constitution, but they do based on the necessary and proper clause. We talked about the institutional powers of Chamber of Congress. That just means the things that the 2 chambers are allowed to do. We talked about the ways in which our representatives vote. There's 3 models of representation. There's the delegate model, the trustee model, and the Politico model. members of Congress serve as a delegate when they vote exactly the way their constituency would like them to. They vote they operate as a delegate when they vote just the way their constituency would like them to. They serve as a trustee when they vote based on what they think is best, regardless of what their constituency would like. Think about the Senator McCain example, where even though his constituency wanted him to vote yes to repeal Obamacare, he voted no because he thought that's what was best. He's operating as a trustee. When they operate as a politico, they're doing both. Sometimes they vote as a delegate and do what their constituency wants. Sometimes they operate as a trustee and do what they think is best. So a political model is doing both. Okay. All right. We talked about the bill to law process. A piece of legislation can start in either chamber unless it is tax bill. Tax bill must start in the House of Representatives and it goes to the Ways and Means Committee. We talked about how a bill is placed in committee and then authored, edited, changed, marked up, placed in subcommittee for interest groups to hold hearings. All of the work of writing the legislation takes place in committee. The majority of seats on the committee are held by the majority party in that chamber. Once the majority of the members of that committee vote to pass that bill, it gets placed on the floor by either the House or the Senate for whole chamber discussion, debate, and vote. Okay. Most bills never make it out of committee. They die in committee. That's called pigeonholed. Most bills are pigeonholed or die in committee. Once it makes it to the floor of the House or the Senate, the whole chamber discusses it in the House of Representatives. The Rules Committee works with the Speaker of the House to place it on the calendar. They're very strict in the House of Representatives and placing strict rules around debate and discussion because they have so many members. They have to be more strict. You cannot add an amendment to a bill on the House floor that is not germane. Ben, would you open the door for me, please? Or Aria? That is not germane or in the same intention of the original legislation. So germane just means it's the same as what the original amendment's about. So if it's tax legislation, you can only amend the bill on the House floor if it deals with the tax measures in the bill. Okay. In the House of Representatives, they don't give anyone any more than 5 minutes to speak. Once they're done discussing, they vote on it and the simple majority passes it, and then it would go to the other chamber. Don't forget about the Committee of the Whole in the House of Representatives. The Committee of the Whole isn't really a formal committee. It just means that once they have 100 or more members, but not everyone present, then they could have more discussion on a bill. So they allow for the Committee of the Whole if they want to open up the bill to more discussion without such formal rules. The Committee of the Whole would discuss it, they would vote on it, and they'd make a recommendation to the whole House on how to vote based on how they vote as a committee. Okay, anyone can be a part of the Committee of the Whole. You're not assigned. In the Senate, the bill would go through the same process. Again, it would be placed in committee, marked up, edited, changed, goes to the whole Senate floor. Senate Pro Tem and the majority leader placed on the calendar, gets debated, discussed. On the Senate floor, a bill can be amended to add anything to it that you want. Amendments to the bill on the Senate floor do not have to be germane, meaning they don't have to be in the same with the same intention of the original bill. So a tax bill could be amended to give people in Carmel Valley a public library. Okay, so pork barrel legislation could be added to a bill on the floor of the Senate, not on the floor of the House. Remember, pork barrel legislation is a law or an amendment to a law that only benefits one constituency group. Okay, in the Senate, they then would vote on the legislation. This is where filibustering takes place. The Senate only can filibuster. Filibuster is a prolonged speech or series of speeches about anything you want, and the intention is to delay a vote. In order to end a filibuster, you have to vote. 60 people have to invoke cloture. Cloture is ending a filibuster. So it's a super majority, and that's why they try and avoid filibustering, because it's hard to do. Okay? So filibustering gives the voice to the minority to try and stall or delay something that's taking place. It can only be used for legislation, right? Once it's voted on the Senate floor, if it passes and it's different from the original bill that they received from the House or vice versa, They meet in a joint committee called a conference committee. They make one final version of the bill. That bill goes back to both chambers for a whole chamber vote. Both chambers vote on it again. They can't amend it at that point. It just passes and it goes to the president. President has lots of options. He can sign it. He can veto it. Congress could then override a presidential with a 2/3 vote, or he could do nothing. If he does nothing, 10 days pass and the congressional term is still going. That bill becomes law without the president's signature. If he doesn't sign it and the term of Congress ends before the president or before the 10 days is up, then the bill dies. It's called a pocket veto. Remember, legislation doesn't carry over to the next term. So a pocket veto is when the president doesn't sign it, but the term of Congress ends before the 10-day period and the bill dies. It does not become a law. Question, Jack.
When you say term, you mean like the 2 years? Or
The 2-year term of Congress. Yes. Excellent. Questions about the bill to law process? About cloture, about Senate and House rules and processes? Yes.
Can you define germane?
Germane just means like in the House they can't. So germane is the original intention of the bill. So if there's a tax bill and it's on the floor of the House of Representatives, they can't add amendments that are not germane or not in the same spirit of the original bill. So like you couldn't amend a tax bill to add a library on the House floor, but you could on the Senate floor. They can add anything they want. Those things they tack on, by the way, are called riders. I think of it like they get a free ride to being a law. They may not pass on their own individually, but if they tack them onto a bill that they think will pass, then they also are now law. They're called riders.
And that's why pork barreling is also allowed.
Yeah, pork barrel legislation happens everywhere. It's just that if it happens in the House of Representatives, it must happen in committee if it's not germane to the intention of the bill. Like if it doesn't fit with the original intention of the bill, they can add anything they want in committee, but once the bill leaves the committee of the House of Representatives and it's on the floor, they can only amend the bill as the bill it stands with the original intention of the bill. Whereas in the Senate, pork barrel legislation and riders can be tacked on at any time, whether it's in committee or it's on the floor. Question, Sonia?
Can you go through the things that the president can do when he gets a bill?
He can sign it.
Okay.
He can veto it. He can ignore it, and in 10 days it becomes a law. Or he can pocket veto it, which means he ignores it, and the term of Congress ends before the 10 days is up, and the bill automatically dies. So remember, he would do that because then it doesn't go back to Congress, and they don't get the chance to override his veto. Okay? Yes, Casey.
Pork barrel is just a law or a law that only helps one political party.
Not a political party. It helps a constituency. So we, if you live in 49 or 52, you are the constituency. You're the people for Scott Peters or for Mike Levin. Constituency is just the people that that person represents. So our state senators, Kamala Harris, her constituency is all of California. So a pork barrel legislation would be a law that Kamala Harris makes and gets passed that only benefits people in California. That's pork barrel legislation. That makes sense? So it's not about party. It's about your constituency, which is just your constituency is just the people that you represent. We are the constituents. Okay? Other questions about Congress and the lawmaking process? I think we covered all of this stuff on the study guide. Don't forget about the structure and power of those structures. So the congressional structure is wholly based on party. So at the top of the House of Representatives, you have the Speaker of the House. The Speaker is the leader of the majority party, followed by the majority leader. Majority leader is also a leader of the majority party. They're selected by the majority party to lead their that part of Congress, the House. Next, we have the minority leader. Then we have the whips for both parties, the majority and minority whips. The whips are basically like the party cheerleaders. They whip everyone into shape, get them to do what their party wants them to do, make sure they're present for key votes. So they're trying to kind of coordinate their party and make sure that they're behaving the way their party would like them to. They're called the whips. And then we have the caucuses. The caucuses are an informal structure of Congress. They don't have any power, but it's a place, it's like either a social group that gets congressmen together Or like we saw last week, the Democrat caucus, basically all the Democrats got together who wanted to, met with Nancy Pelosi, and they talked about what they were going to do with impeachment. That caucus has no power. It's just like a club of all the Democrats. Okay. Don't forget that oftentimes log rolling, exchanging votes, is an outcome of people's relationships that form through caucuses, right? Log rolling is, hey, I'll vote for your legislation if you vote for my legislation. It's a way to exchange votes. So I might not care about your legislation. You might not care about mine, but we both need votes. So we exchange votes. So we vote for each other's legislation to try and get them passed. Okay. In the Senate, the structure is pretty similar, except at the top, we have the Senate pro tempore. He's the senior most leader of the majority party, meaning he's the guy or girl who has served the longest in the Senate for the majority party. Then you have the majority leader, and then everything else is the same. Minority leader, you have the whips, you have the caucuses. And then don't forget that both chambers have committees. The key committees you need to know, by the way, Ways and Means Committee, House of Representatives, they author all tax legislation. You have the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate. They make the budget. You have the Rules Committee. They set all the rules for how the House of Representatives behaves and operates. I think those are the main committees that you need to know. All right. And the majority of seats on every single committee, as well as the committee chair, comes from a majority party. Question, Sonia?
What was the middle one that you said?
The whips?
No,
The party. Ways and Means, appropriations. They set the budget.
Thank you.
Um,
Both the Senate and the House.
Mhm.
Is that a joint committee or just separate?
They work separately, but I'm sure they technically they're separate, but I bet they work a lot together a lot. Okay. And then we have I don't remember that one that I mentioned. Also, I'm thinking about Congress. Some of the congressional powers that you must know. Congress declares war, technically. Okay. Congress sets the budget, not the president. And then all the others. Congress makes the laws. Yes.
And so can't the president like authorize like acts of war?
I'm going to get to that when I get to the
Okay.
president. Yeah, we'll talk about the war powers resolution and what president does to kind of get around the Congress's ability to declare war. Other questions? Yes, Mel.
Can you go over the institutional powers of Congress again?
Yep. So that's just what the House and Senate can do that the other chamber doesn't have the right to do. So the House can impeach, vote to impeach. The House can decide who's president in case of a tie in the Electoral College. And the House can also, they must author tax legislation. Tax legislation must start in the House of Representatives. The Senate holds the impeachment trial. They become the jury in an impeachment trial. The Senate must approve of all presidential appointments by simple majority. And the Senate must ratify all presidential treaties with a 2/3 vote.
Okay, thank you.
Any others? Ready to move on from Congress?
Wait, you said that the Senate can declare war?
Yes, that's their job. Congress declares war.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not going to go over this because I feel like you guys are good with this, but make sure you look at this last one, which says checks. How do they check each other? So like I would go back and study that chart that you did in Unit 1 on the checks and balances that each branch has over the other. Okay. All right. Next up is the executive branch. So executive branch was detailed by Fed 70. Fed 70 was written by Alexander Hamilton. And in Fed 70, Hamilton is advocating for a single executive rather than a plural executive. So he thought that a single executive would get more done more quickly. It would lead to less discontent and disagreement if there was a plural executive. And he thought that that was the way that we should go. So Fed 70 is really advocating for a single executive. All right, let's talk about the executive branch. Qualifications to be president, you got to be 35. You have to be a natural born citizen. You have to be a resident for, how many years is it? 14 years, I believe. Okay, in order to be eligible for president. Some of the amendments that you need to know relating to the presidency, the 12th Amendment. 12th Amendment said that the president and the vice president run on the same ticket, meaning that they run together. When you vote for president, you are also voting for his or her chosen vice president. Previously, the first top vote getter from the Electoral College became president, and the second top vote getter became vice president. That was changed with the 12th Amendment. Okay. The 20th Amendment says that a term of Congress starts on January 3rd of an odd numbered year following the election. And the term of the president starts on January 20th at noon on the odd numbered year following the federal presidential election, which is in the even numbered year. 22nd Amendment said, what's the 22nd? Thank you. Forgot. 2 terms. President would serve 2 terms. Oh, that's easy to remember because it's 22. President can serve 2 terms only. The most someone could serve, by the way, is 10 years. Don't forget. Vice president, if they take over in the second half of a president's term, is eligible to serve 2 more terms. If they take over in the first half of a president's term, they could serve the rest of that term and 1 more if they got elected on their own. Okay. And then the 25th Amendment created the order of succession. President, vice president. If the president dies or is impeached or resigns, the vice president takes over. He gets to appoint his own new vice president when he becomes president.
Wait, which number was that?
25th Amendment. If the vice president and president are both out, the next in line would be the Speaker of the House, followed by the President pro tem. And then you go to the Secretary of State and all of the cabinet positions in the order in which they were created. If the president is temporarily unable to do his job due to illness or something else, then the 25th Amendment also says that the vice president would serve in his presidential capacity as the president until the president is able to come back and take over his office. Yes.
If the vice president serves in a presidential capacity for a certain amount of time, and then the president, like
I don't know.
would it count as more than 10? If that
It still
as-
counts. I believe it still counts toward the president whose term it is, his term, not the vice president's term. Yeah, right.
So whoever becomes the new president, does the Senate still have to approve who they choose?
Nope. The one time the Senate doesn't approve of a presidential appointment is when the president picks their own vice president. That's kind of crazy, huh? That's crazy. Okay. All right. So that's how you become president. Those are the amendments that are important. Formal powers of the president are things like presidential pardoning. They can make treaties with the consent of the Senate. They can make appointments, again, with the consent of the Senate. What else can the president do formally?
So it's those treaties, pardons, and what-
Treaties, pardons. Oh, they can recognize and appoint ambassadors. They can make appointments with the consent of the Senate. The Senate has to approve of presidential appointments. They sign bills to law, nominate justices and other cabinet members. Jordan,
What was the 20th amendment?
hold on one second. Other formal amendments. I'll come back to it. Other formal things that they can do. I can't think of any more off the top of my head right now. Lila.
They can have like brief military action.
Okay, good. Brief military, because they are, thank you, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. They are Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, okay? Presidents, we know, do lots of things that the Constitution doesn't allow them to. I haven't forgotten your question, Jordan. Because of the take care clause. So don't forget the necessary and proper clause gives Congress wiggle room to do things that aren't specifically stated in the Constitution. Take care clause is the president's version of the necessary proper clause. So they do a whole bunch of things that aren't listed in the Constitution. So they do things like executive agreements, which is an agreement between the president and a foreign dignitary that is informal, so it doesn't require Senate approval like a treaty does. When they sign bills into law, they oftentimes use signing statements. A signing statement is basically saying how they intend to interpret the law, since their job is to enforce the law, which is a formal power, enforcing the law. So signing statement is kind of like their own spin on the law and how they intend to interpret the law. We know that presidents make executive agreements, which carry the weight of law, even though they are technically not listed in the Constitution. That right has been protected under the Take Care Clause. And then presidents also have executive privilege to have private conversations with their people in their cabinet and in their branch. And we're also learning, thanks to our current situation, they also have executive privilege when it comes to conversations with foreign dignitaries. The intention of executive privilege is to protect the president so he can have confidential conversations, do the right thing, and also to protect national security. Okay. The 20th Amendment, to get back to your question, Jordan, and then I'll come back to you, Callie, was said when their presidential term begins, January 20th at noon. And Congress's term starts on January 3rd. And those both happen in the even numbered year. Sorry, odd numbered year following the election in the even numbered year.
But they both start on the odd.
They both start on the odd. So the election happens in November 2020. The new term of Congress will happen January 3rd, 2021. And the new term for the new president, or if Trump is reelected, will happen on January 20th, 2021. Question, Callie.
Oh, you said executive privilege, it's like private conversations between
Yes.
the appointed to your own cabinet member?
Yep, or people that were anybody who works in the executive branch. They are allowed to have private conversations that are not publicized or recorded or private. The media is not privy to. If it's a situation that is of national security, so that's why private, like the conversation with the Ukrainian president, before the whistleblower and before the DNI talked to Congress, he wanted to make sure executive privilege didn't apply. So he couldn't technically tell the Congress until he knew if executive privilege existed or not.
So they can hide national security, or they can't?
They can hide their conversations if it's a matter of national security. I mean, we don't want that stuff in the news, right? So it makes sense. All right. So we talked about, we talked about signing statements and pocket veto. We talked about the legislative branch. We hit executive agreements. Let's talk about the War Powers Act and then, and the State of the Union, and I'll come back to bully pulpit in a second. Well, War Powers Act, so Stephen had mentioned that presidents kind of work around this whole Congress declares war thing. So we know Congress hasn't declared war since World War II. We know that presidents, however, have committed troops into battle. The War Powers Resolution was passed in 1973 in direct response to LBJ's increased involvement of our troops in Vietnam. It said that the president can commit troops to battle because they're the commander-in-chief. However, within 48 hours, they must notify Congress. Congress has 60 days to declare war. If they don't declare war within 60 days, the president can request a 30-day extension. But after 90 days, if Congress hasn't declared war, then those troops technically should be coming home. But we know that that is something that has never been tested, and that presidents violate this law all the time. Okay. State of the Union address is another formal power listed in the Constitution. It says that the president may from time to time address the Congress on the State of the Union. We know that this is a great example today of how presidents use the power of the presidency to try and influence national policy and national agenda, because Congress technically makes the laws. So they stand up and it's televised and the whole world watches, and they talk about all the things that Congress is going to do or should do in the next congressional term and in the upcoming year. This is an example of the president using that power of the office as a bully pulpit. So we talked about a bully pulpit as the president using their power and influence to try and influence other people to do what they want. In the case of the State of the Union, he's using the bully pulpit to try and influence Congress. We saw some examples of where Obama called out the Supreme Court for a decision. He's using the bully pulpit of the State of the Union to disagree with the Supreme Court in a very open manner. Okay, so the office is very powerful, and presidents use it frequently to try and get their way to influence national agenda, because they say all these things and promise all these things when they run for presidency, but they have to rely on Congress to actually get those things done. We talked about executive orders, agreements, and privileges. We never talked about the lame duck in our class. Lame duck is the person who just got elected out. Okay, so for example, when Trump was elected in 2016, from November 2016 until January 20th, 2017, when Trump was sworn into office, during that time, Obama was a lame duck president. What that means is they're on their way out. Their last few months, they really lose a lot of influence and power because they're not going to be around any longer. So it's a lot harder to get things done. They're considered to be a lame duck. Think about how easy it would be to get rid of or to, capture a lame duck. They don't do anything. They're just kind of floating in the water, hanging out, waiting for their time to end. That's where that term comes from. All right, we talked about Fed 70. We talked about Article 2. We've already talked about those court cases. We talked about eligibility. We talked about the amendments, formal and informal powers, policy agenda. Ooh, let's talk about the bureaucracy. All right, so the bureaucracy is all the people that do the work of the government. They technically work in the executive branch, although they're created by the legislative branch. Congress makes a law. Congress might create a federal agency, even a specific director, like the Director of National Intelligence, give them some rules and responsibilities, set them to work. But since Congress makes the law and the executive branch executes the law, the bureaucracy technically falls under the umbrella of the executive branch. Okay? So they work for the executive. So all of the people that do the work of the government are part of the bureaucracy, and they work in the executive branch. So we talked about there being millions and millions, like almost 4 million people that do the work of the bureaucracy, the work of the government. They're in the executive branch, and they're called the bureaucracy. Previously, the bureaucracy was subject to the spoils system, where people were given jobs not based on merit, but based on patronage or who they knew. A president would give jobs to people based on favors they had done, or maybe if they'd helped them get reelected. The Pendleton Civil Service Reform was an attempt to clean up the spoils system and create a merit-based system. So now about 90% of bureaucrats get their jobs through the merit system, where they take a test, do an interview, have to have some qualifications before they are given that job. The spoils system or patronage still exists for about 10% of the bureaucracy. Think about all those presidential appointments. The president doesn't technically have to follow any specific qualifications for those jobs. They can give those appointment jobs to whoever they want to. So that's the spoils system, okay? The bureaucracy does lots of things. There are regulatory agencies like the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, or the FDA, Food and Drug Agency Administration, or the FEC, Federal Elections Commission, and they regulate certain elements of our government and of our consumer base. There are private corporations like the post office. They are basically a government-run business. So they're a business controlled by the government. And then there are all the agencies like FBI, CIA, that do the actual work of all of the 15 department positions for the cabinet. So there's lots of different agencies that work for the bureaucracy. I'll answer a question 1 second, Jordan. Each of the branches, don't forget about the Iron Triangle. The Iron Triangle is that very complex and very strong relationship that is hard to break between Congress, a bureaucratic agency, and between an interest group. So Congress gives the bureaucratic agency money and authority. The bureaucratic agency carries out services, provides services to an interest group, to the people, and the people provide Congress with votes. So they all need each other for some reason. So it's called the Iron Triangle. It's a complex and very strong relationship between Congress, the bureaucracy, and people. And then we talked about discretionary and rulemaking authority. So basically what that means is Congress gives discretion to bureaucratic agencies to basically elaborate on the law, to carry out the law how they see fit, because they are the professionals and experts in that field. So discretionary authority is just giving freedom to the bureaucratic agencies to do what they think is best in carrying out the laws. Rulemaking authority is when the bureaucracy adds to create specific rules. They're almost like laws to elaborate or further define legislation so that they can carry out their job in a way that is consistent. So it's like adding laws to the law. It's rulemaking authority. They're allowed to do it. Question, Jordan, before we talk about how the branches each check the bureaucracy.
Yeah. So like, what is the executive branch like structure? Like, is it like in the House how they have like?
Good question. You got the president, vice president. You've got his chief of staff, press secretary. Those are like his close people. Okay. Then you have the cabinet. Those are the 15 department heads. They're all called secretary, except for the attorney general, who's called attorney general. And they lead all the different departments. And then under them are all of the bureaucratic agencies that fall into those different departments.
Okay.
That make sense?
Yeah.
Good question. Other questions? No.
Is patronage like the same thing as the spoils system?
Patronage is the same exact thing as spoil system.
Okay,
Patronage is just giving government jobs to people who might not be qualified.
okay, and then what was compliance monitoring again?
So I don't think we studied that. It won't be on your test.
Okay,
So, but it's basically part of the bureaucracy has responsibility to make sure that the agencies are in compliance and also carrying out the law in the way that they should be. But it won't be on your test. All right. So how does Congress have oversight power over the bureaucracy? So Congress makes the bureaucracy. They hold them accountable through committee hearings. We saw that firsthand last week, where they call a director or a leader of one of the bureaucratic agencies to testify to make sure that they're doing their jobs in a way that the Congress intended. They also have oversight through funding. They decide how much the bureaucratic agencies get in the way of funding. Okay. The executive branch has oversight over the bureaucracy because he appoints all of the leaders to all of the top departments, the State Department or the 15 departments. So he does all of the appointments at the top levels. That's one way he has oversight over the bureaucracy. And also they technically work for him because they're part of the executive branch. So he can yield his influence in that way. And then the judicial branch might check the bureaucracy. If somebody sues a bureaucratic agency for wrongdoing, that lawsuit would end up in the federal courts because it's about the federal bureaucracy, in which case the federal courts would get involved. Yes, Maddie.
But the Senate doesn't actually have to listen to what the judicial branch has to say, right? Or Congress, not just when they make.
But
their
if like the
final
bureaucracy did something wrong, violated a law, then the judicial branch would get involved and say you violated that law and you have to pay some penalty or there's some fine.
Okay.
So they would technically if they did the wrong thing.
Got it.
Yeah. So like if the FBI wrongfully investigated you or violated some right that you have by the Bill of Rights, they would be held accountable for that by the judicial branch.
Okay.
Any other questions about the bureaucracy or the president? Bam. Making it happen. One more. All right, judicial branch. This should be easy because we just did this. All right, Fed 78. Fed 78, also written by Alexander Hamilton. In Fed 78, Hamilton is advocating for life terms, not life sentences. It sounds like they're prisoners. Life terms for the judicial branch. He thought that they were the weakest branch. He also thought that it would be important that they were politically insulated or removed from the other two branches. So I hope that I illustrated that for you guys today. That while the process is political for people when they get on the bench, once they're there, they are politically isolated from the other branches and from the world. Okay, they are not political in nature. Please do not forget Marbury versus Madison, 1803. Dealt with the midnight judges. One of the judges sued for his judgeship. In the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court first established the precedent of judicial review, meaning it is the judicial branch's job to review laws and determine their constitutionality. No law that Congress makes can violate the Constitution. In the case of Marbury v. Madison, they found the particular law in question unconstitutional. Okay. All right. So we talked about a 3-tiered system for our federal judicial branch. At the bottom, question before we go to the structure.
Yeah.
Yes.
For the
Jack.
Marbury versus Madison was the law that
Judicial act of, I don't remember the exact law year.
it wasn't that like.
No, it wasn't. All right. So at the bottom, we have the U.S. district courts. There are 94 of them. There's about 700 judges that work in these district courts. They have original jurisdiction, meaning they hear a case for the first time. These are trial by jury with a judge courts, just like you see on TV. There's one district court in every single state and U.S. territory, and then some larger states like California have multiple district courts. We have one here in San Diego. Okay, if you don't like the outcome at the district court, you can appeal that decision, and your appeal would be heard in a circuit court. There are 11 circuits plus 2 in Washington, D.C. We here in California are in the 9th Circuit. The circuit courts are not a trial court, and they have appellate jurisdiction, meaning it's an appeals court. The case has already been heard by the district court. There's a panel of 3 judges. They hear the case. Much like the Supreme Court, they hear from the two attorneys. They receive briefs from those attorneys on what the attorneys think should be the outcome and the facts of the case. They make a decision, majority rules. If you don't like that outcome, you can give a petition to the Supreme Court to hear your case. We learned today that that's called a writ of certiorari. It's a petition to the court to hear your case. And the writ of certiorari is requesting that the Supreme Court hear your case. Only about 90 to 100 of the 10,000 writ of certiorari that the Supreme Court receive, or petitions they receive every year, are heard. Before we talk about that process, let's talk a little bit about senatorial courtesy and litmus test. So anytime a vacancy happens in the entire federal judicial branch, the president gets to appoint a judge. That's why in the data I showed you today, Bill Clinton got to appoint 305 judges. It's because there's 700 in the district courts, 300-ish in the circuit courts, plus the Supreme Court. It's a lot of opportunity. So even though they all serve for life, if there is a retirement or somebody passes away, then the president gets to make an appointment. He doesn't know that many judges, so they use two things: senatorial courtesy. What that means is they go to the senator in that state and they say, "Hey, senator, who do you recommend for this judgeship, this position that's open in the district court in your state?" Senators make a recommendation. They don't have to ask the senators, but they do. It's a courtesy. And it's gotten to the point where this is such a protected courtesy that oftentimes the Senate Judiciary Committee won't even approve of an appointment if the president hasn't talked to the senator from that state first. So presidents also use the litmus test. We know our Republican presidents want to appoint judges that practice judicial restraint. And we know that our Democrat presidents want to appoint people that practice judicial activism. As a result of that, they look through their case history to try and figure out, are they a conservative or a liberal judge when they're making their appointment. So two practices that they use. We know because of this, though, and especially because of senatorial courtesy, certain circuits, like the Ninth Circuit in California, have reputations. Our circuit is a more liberal circuit. Makes sense. We're a mostly Democrat state. Our Democrat senators are going to recommend, through senatorial courtesy, judicial activist judges. Okay, so it makes sense that our circuits kind of take on the political ideology of the territory that they represent. Okay. All right. So Supreme Court gets the writ of certiorari. 4 justices, called the Rule of 4, agree to hear a case. That means the case is granted a cert, meaning the case gets to go before the Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, it's not a trial court like you think of in the district courts. It is 9 justices. They hear from the 2 attorneys. They receive briefs from the attorneys. They also receive amicus curiae briefs. These are friend of the court briefs written by a third party who is not directly involved in the case. Usually it's an interest group who has an interest in the outcome of the case. In the attorney briefs and in the writ of the amicus curiae briefs, they talk about the case. They cite precedent or stare decisis from previous cases to try and advocate that the Supreme Court rule in a certain way. Okay. We know that judicial activism is a liberal, loose interpretation of the law and the Constitution. Judicial activists would like to further the law by including modern circumstances and modern times in making their decisions. Judicial restraint is a conservative, Republican, preferred interpretation of the law. It's strict interpretation of the law. They interpret the law exactly as it is. So for the purposes of the FRQ tomorrow, you would talk about how Democrats prefer judicial activists because they are more liberal and loose in their interpretation of the law. They're going to forward civil liberties around things that are really vague, like privacy. Doesn't actually say in the Constitution we have a right to privacy, but a liberal judge would want to further privacy rights, further free speech rights, because speech isn't just the things that come out of our mouth. It's a lot more open to interpretation than that. Whereas a judicial restraintist, preferred by Republicans, conservative judge who would conservatively or strictly interpret the law, is really going to want to make sure to protect civil liberties that are very explicitly stated in the Constitution, like the right to bear arms. It very clearly says that. Like freedom of religion. It very clearly says that in the Constitution. So those are the kinds of civil liberties that judicial restraintists want to protect. What do you got for me? What questions? We got 5 minutes. That's pretty good.
That was good.
Who needs like 3 weeks of AP Gov when you can do it in 45 minutes? Okay, question, Casey.
Judicial restraint protects explicit civil liberties.
Judicial restraint is, yes, explicit civil liberties that you can very see that are tangible. Right to bear arms. There's no other way to interpret that.
Okay, and the activists forward civil liberties.
Activists. Okay, I really appreciate what Casey just said. Can you guys all hear? Because this is a common misconception. So Casey said that. Trying to get on the video. You want to wave for your friends at home? You really do. All right. Judicial activists. It's not that judicial activists like civil liberties and judicial restraintists don't. Okay? It's just that they forward different civil liberties. They advocate or fight for different civil liberties. Our civil liberties, guys, are the Bill of Rights. It's first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which you're going to learn about for homework tomorrow, so it's kind of backwards. I know. But Bill of Rights. So the judicial restraintists are going to want to protect the rights that are very clearly defined in the Bill of Rights, like right to bear arms. It says that very clearly in the Constitution. That's an easy one for a judicial restraintist to protect because it's clearly stated there. A judicial activist is going to protect rights that aren't explicitly stated in the Constitution, but they think that are implied and important to modern times. So, for example, the abortion one that we talked about today, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that we have a right to privacy. It's implied by certain amendments that protect like search and seizure without a warrant and those kinds of things. Basically means we have a right to privacy unless we have a reason for the government to take away our privacy. But it doesn't specifically say privacy. But a judicial activist will further those rights because it's kind of broad and it's important for modern times. So it's just different civil liberties that they advocate for. Yes, Lila.
For appellate jurisdiction.
Appellate jurisdiction just means a court of appeals. They don't hear it originally for the first time. They hear the court case after a decision has already been made by a lower court. It's been appealed. So appellate jurisdiction means they hear it as because the case has been appealed. Does that make sense? Questions? Sonia.
So are you saying that like activists, like
Judicial activists.
there it is, would not protect or like would not argue for example, the right to bear arms and also abortion? They would only really argue for abortion and the right to privacy?
So good question. So a judicial activist is going to advocate for a right to abortion because they believe it's part of privacy. They would probably be less inclined to black and white protect gun rights because they also, don't forget, are taking a modern interpretation. So they might say, well, we've had all of these mass shootings. So we need to, yes, the Second Amendment says you have a right to bear arms. We can't get rid of guns altogether. And also we should look at modern times and look at legislation that, or protect legislation that considers the modern times in addition to what the law says. So it's not like they disregard the law, guys. They just say that like the law is important and also so are modern circumstances.
Okay.
Whereas a judicial restraintist is like, take the Constitution as is. Okay? Mel.
So if only 4 judges are needed to approve
Rule of
it,
4. Yep.
Yeah, to grant a cert, like how come only 90 to 100 cases? Like how come they
Just
only
because they only meet from October to June. So they only hear about 90 to 100 cases just because of the time that they have in a year. So if they're hearing cases, if they're only reviewing cases October to June, and then from June to October, they're determining what cases they want to hear, they could never hear 10,000 cases. So what they do is they pick the cases that they think are most important, whether they're seeing a trend, like there's a bunch of gun cases or abortion cases, or because of what's going on in the world right now.
Okay.
So they try and prioritize their time.
Okay.
Hold on, guys. If you're going to leave, you're totally welcome to. Just do it quietly, please, so I can answer these last 2 questions. Thank you. Good luck. Sleep, drink water, eat. You're going to do great. Mel, you laugh at me when I say sleep. I mean it. Good question. The circuit court, just like the Supreme Court, gets to decide what cases they want to approve for appeal.
Okay.
They might say, nope, we're not going to hear your case, or yes, we're going to hear your case. But you have a better chance of making it to the Court of Appeals than you do the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, guys. Good luck. Sleep, eat, drink water.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions? Yes.